Oh my goodness, we have a lot of people here already. Hello, hello. As we wait for people to join us at noon, well, we are here in sunny Toronto. I know you can't see because I have a board behind me. But let us know where you are from. You can use the open chat. We're curious to know what brings you here. We are here to reimagine and rethink what governance can look like in our nonprofits. So really eager to hear what brings you all here. You know, we have folks joining us from London, from Guelph, from Ottawa. We're so excited to see so many folks here from across Ontario. Welcome to all of those who are joining us freshly. We're all wondering where people are joining us from, so please feel free to let us know in the open chat. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Just going to wait another 2 minutes to start the webinar. Hope you've got your lunch. Oh, we've got people here from Kingston, Thunder Bay. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Yes. Oh, from Barrie. Hello. Welcome. Peterborough. Calgary. Hello. I'll be there next week. Hello to those of us new to joining us. We are just waiting to start right at noon. Please feel free to let us know where you're joining us from. Grab that lunchtime coffee or tea. Just get settled. Hello, everyone in Toronto. Hope you're enjoying the sun. Finally. Hello, Etobicoke. Prince Edward Island, hello. Clinton, thanks for joining. Excellent. To everyone just joining the webinar, we'll just wait another few seconds to get fully started, so please settle in. Let us know where you're joining us from. We've got people from all over Ontario and Canada, actually, from different provinces. We'd love to know what brings you to the conversation for those who are coming from different provinces. Thanks so much for being here. Sudbury, Iqaluit, hello. Welcome. So we are also going to launch a quick poll for those who have joined us now. We are wondering if you are a board member, if you are an executive director, part of senior management, perhaps you're all of the above, none of the above. So please let us know in the poll. Okay, lots of board members, lots of EDs, lots of other, we're with you. And welcome to everyone else who is joining the webinar. We're just wondering where you're from, what brings you here. If you are a board member, an ED, or senior management, part of other teams, please let us know. Amazing. Okay. So yes, to those who are newly joining, please take part in the participant poll we have just put out. Thank you so much to everyone who has voted already. So happy for everyone joining us. Okay, hello Brampton. Excellent, so it is 12:02. We will just get started. So as we're coming in, please keep letting us know where you're from, what brings you here. Let us know what your position that you is. And I would just like to start off our session by acknowledging that the Ontario Nonprofit Network is situated on Treaty 13 territories. These are the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Métis Nation. If you are new to the Ontario Nonprofit Network, the ONN is the provincial network for nonprofits and charities. We work to help strengthen the nonprofit sector by engaging with and for nonprofits and charities in communities across Ontario. As we have seen through the people who are joining us and where you're all situated, we know that we have people all across the country and province who are interested in this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd love to introduce myself and our amazing panelists, our presenters today. We have Linda Mollenhauer from Ignite. Yes, maybe you'd like to wave a little bit to the camera. We've got Lisa Lalonde joining us as well from ONFP. Supporting us today from ONN, we have Sarah Mestre, and she is managing the chat. Do you want to say hi? Hi everyone. My name is Erin Kang. I'm the engagement coordinator for the Reimagining governance project. Thank you so much for being here. And I'll just say one last time for those of you who are joining us newly, we would love if you help us out by letting us know what your position is currently by taking our participant poll and using our open chat. You can let us know where you're joining us from and what brings you here to the conversation.
Just to jump in, there's a bit of an echo here, and we're not getting the best audio.
Okay, we have an audio issue, but we're just going to talk fixing right now. But I will just let you know as well that we will be sending out a version of the deck after the webinar finishes. We are recording the webinar as well. And we will send it all to you, and we should wrap up by 1 p.m. We also will have a dedicated question and answer period at the end of the webinar. To give you an overview of the webinar, we will be challenging 2 common assumptions about governance. We will be sharing some high-level learnings from research. We'll be talking about the idea of tinkering or transforming, and we will share an overview of the Reimagining Governance project.
No, she's using the mic.
What you will take away is ideas and research about governance to reflect on. You will carry forward 3 critical questions that we are asking about reimagining governance. And truly, we are looking for you to help us shape the work of reimagining governance moving forward. So a quick check-in with our audio. You good?
I think we're better.
Okay. Let us know in the chat if you're still having issues with our audio. So sorry to hear that that is happening. And yeah, and we are going to just share the links to the research with you that we circulated, and we will be sharing this after the webinar as well. Okay, and we will be launching one more poll before we get started. It is to ask you who is currently responsible for governance in your organization. We're asking if it's the board, the executive director or chief executive officer, director, senior managers, perhaps other stakeholders, some of the above, all of the above. Please let us know. And as we get that going, we will pass it off to Linda to talk about the first assumption.
Thanks, Erin. We're actually going to share 2 assumptions with you today that many people hold about governance. And we believe that these assumptions may be getting in the way of our ability to significantly improve our organizational governance structures, processes.
It wouldn't be Toronto without sirens.
Exactly. The first assumption is that board and governance are the same thing. As you know, they're often used interchangeably. When I say, for example, these are governance roles and responsibilities. Many people in their heads are hearing these are the board's roles and responsibilities. Or when we talk about the problems of governance, people hear it as problems with boards. But in fact, they're different. Governance is a set of functions. Those functions are things like ensuring there are strategic directions and priorities, and that resources are being used wisely and for impact. So, if governance is a set of functions, the board is a structure that's been put in place to help fulfill them. But we know that board members aren't the only ones doing the organization's governance work. Executive directors and the senior management team are making all kinds of governance decisions, or at least actively facilitating those decisions. With the increasing amount of collaboration and integration, where organizations are working across systems, more and more governance decision-making is in fact taking place outside the limits of a single organizational board. So the word governance and board shouldn't be used interchangeably. So we're hoping you have had coffee and that you're still with us on this. But here's the key takeaway. If we can detach board from governance, then different solutions emerge about how we can make governance work better. For example, here's an often asked question. How can our 8 or 12 or 15-person board represent diversity? The answer is usually to try and recruit for all the demographics on the board. So the board is comprised of a young person, a corporate person, a constituent, and there are representatives of different ethnicities and cultures. But as many of you know, this can lead to tokenism and make integrative thinking very hard to do. Now, instead of this approach to diversity, let's detach governance and board. So the question becomes not how can we make our board more diverse, but instead, how can we ensure that more diverse people are participating in our governance decision making? This takes us down a very different path. For example, now we start asking who should be part of governance decision making beyond the board, and how can we utilize shared decision making approaches? Boards don't need to have all the diversity that is required sitting at the table. What those board members do need is to be highly competent at engaging, listening, and sharing power so that diverse voices are sharing in the governance decision making. There are lots of other questions we could ask differently. Here's just one other. Instead of asking, how do we ensure our board members have all the competencies required to govern this complex management, which frankly is impossible to do, we ask, how do we design a governance structure which includes, but is not limited to the board, that allows us to acquire the competencies that are needed? So that's assumption one. I'm going to hand it back to Erin and then to Lisa to talk about our second assumption.
Thank you so much. And this is absolutely fascinating research. I just want to mention that we are getting lots of messages about the audio. I want to assure everybody we are actually using a separate microphone and our audio is off. We are just working with the team to figure out how to do better, so thank you for your patience. We would love for you to let us know in the open chat what you feel some of the roles and responsibilities of a board are, given some of the things that Linda has said, but based on your experience, based on your time working in the nonprofit sector, and if you, because my colleague has just exited the room to check on the audio, please, if you do share examples with us, we will read them out shortly. And we will pass it to Lisa for assumption number 2.
Great. So assumption number 2, there are rigid rules about how governance can be done. And I think many of you may believe there are rigid rules about how governance can be done, but in fact, organizations have significant discretion in the structure and focus of their governance body. There are no rules or requirements for boards to act as the one and only governance entity of a nonprofit corporation. There are minimal specs regarding governance structures, processes, and practices, and this leaves a lot of flexibility. It gives the sector really the agency to change the way that governance is done. So what are the core legal requirements for nonprofits then? Our research focused on incorporated nonprofits in Ontario, and before I dive in, I just wanted to flag that this overview is not intended to provide legal advice. It's really designed to provide a high-level overview of the core legal requirements in order to ground this conversation today. So incorporated nonprofit organizations, of course, must have a board of directors, and they must provide organizational oversight to ensure that resources are used efficiently and effectively. They have a duty of care to exercise diligence and skill, and they must act in the best interests of the organization, which is their fiduciary duty. And they also must ensure the organization's financial stability. There are other statutory requirements that may apply depending on the type of programs and services an organization offers, such as those in the area of health or criminal justice or children, etc. And there are, of course, also rules from the Canada Revenue Agency's Charities Directorate that provides, the Charities Directorate provides additional oversight as well for charitable organizations. While boards can delegate responsibilities and activities to management, or any other person, they have ultimate accountability and liability. There is no standard size for all boards, and the legal requirements vary by province. In Ontario, nonprofits require a minimum of 3 directors for incorporation. Boards are generally elected by the membership, and there are limits on how long a board term can be, so it's 4 years in Ontario. But there are no limits on the number of terms. So that means unless a member does something illegal and there are no existing policies, they can stay on in perpetuity. And in Ontario, only 1/3 of directors of public benefit corporations can be employees of the corporation. Boards also appoint the leader of the organization, the CEO or the ED. But beyond these rules, an organization can determine for themselves their preferred governance structures, processes, and practices. So this begs the question, what is effective governance? There is no ideal or most effective model of governance that will work for all organizations. In practice, effective organizational governance is influenced by the life cycle of the board, the organizational structure and culture, the power dynamics between the board and the staff, and the leadership of the board chair and the executive director. When it comes to improving organizational governance, most of the literature to date has focused on building exceptional boards. And it suggests that boards are more effective when they fulfill a broad scope of functions listed here, including supporting advocacy and fundraising. But as you can see from the figure, many of these responsibilities go beyond the actual work of governance. So, is this working for the majority of organizations? I'm going to dive into that shortly, but I'm going to pass things back to Erin.
Thank you so much. So what we have just done is challenge 2 assumptions about boards. If you can not hear me, please let us know in the chat, as we've just done some muting. But anyway, so we have challenged 2 assumptions that the board equals governance and that there are rigid rules to how this governance is done. We would love to know in the open chat If you are surprised by this, let us know. You can use a little surprised emoji or just the word surprised. And if this is all news to you, if you're not surprised by this information, please also let us know. I'd also love to share one of the comments that we've received in the open chat, and I'd love to pass it to feedback from Lisa and Linda. And it's a very good point that the board is responsible for governance, but it doesn't mean that members should not seek out diverse opinions from others. Could you maybe speak to that briefly?
Go ahead.
The interesting thing is that the board is responsible for governance. But the board isn't the only one in the organization that is actually playing a part in governance. So I would take that question and go even further with it to say that, in fact, there are a lot of more people beyond the board that are doing the work of governance, and that's an important piece to acknowledge. So the question isn't so much, can the board, should we be talking to members and so on? It's really sort of stepping way back from there and saying, who are all the people who are actually engaged in governance in an organization? And I think if you start to do that as an organization, you're going to find that it's going beyond your board, including the membership.
Thank you. And so, Lisa, I will pass it back to you to talk about the efficacy of governance.
Sure. Thank you. So there are a lot of governance models and frameworks. There is an abundance of training, education, and resources to improve governance. And despite all of these, our research suggests that boards are struggling with leadership and management issues. Research suggested that many board members feel disengaged, and many boards remain underutilized, dysfunctional, or overburdened with operational issues. Informants and focus group participants talked about how some executive directors were spending a great deal of time keeping board members informed and involved, which took away from delivering their core work of running the organization. Others indicated they avoided this by managing up. And what I mean by that is they carefully selected what board members would see and what they would weigh in on. But this can create situations where boards are making critical decisions without a complete picture of what's actually going on. In contrast, other boards are fulfilling operational functions due to the lack of staff capacity. We also heard that there may be some challenges with member-driven governance models, such as federations, such as those used in federations. Boards have a tendency to focus on self-preservation over shared interests. And while there are a lot of really great examples of boards that surfaced through our research, but it is highly variable. And things like a change in the board chair, ED capacity, whether the organization is in a city or a small community, mission appeal, or the ability to recruit, all of those factors influence whether organizational governance can be effective or not. And focus group participants talked about an increasing tendency towards ED burnout, which is quite concerning. So what could be at the heart of this? What trends are impacting governance? And this touches on a bit of, or builds off of, the question that you had a moment ago, Linda. But organizations we saw that are increasingly reflecting on the nature of meaningful engagement with the populations represented or served, and how that might need to change their governance structures. For example, maybe less hierarchical models of decision-making and increasing transparency and openness. There's also an increasing focus on systems change, which demands that governance be shared across organizations. Boards are expected to situate their missions within a broader collective effort. There's also an increasing number of mergers and consolidations, and boards often lack the skill sets to evaluate potential mergers. And data and technology is increasingly transforming organizations and their governance practices. Data literacy and lack of capacity, resources, technical skill sets limit an organization's ability to engage with data-related issues in a strategic way. And boards have a really important role in improving organizational data maturity so that it can improve overall performance and track outcomes. And we're also seeing that governance is becoming increasingly focused on revenue generation and performance and outcomes measurement. The rise of outcomes funding arrangements such as pay for performance contracting or social impact bonds requires a specialized experience and skill set, expertise, which many lack. And the workforce in the sector is increasingly comprised of older individuals who will soon retire. Volunteering is becoming more short-term, individualized, and skills-based. These trends pose some significant challenges for boards that rely on a consistent base of volunteers to do their work. So ultimately, this changing environment is requiring boards to deal with significant diversity and complexity, and they have to work across systems. So to navigate this environment, board members need to be data experts, strategists, sense makers. They need to be financially literate, willing to take calculated risks while being inclusive, resilient, and self-aware. Many boards are struggling to adjust to the changing environment, and they're facing capacity and recruitment issues. So these trends overall are altering expectations of governance and creating tensions within organizations that can be difficult to reconcile. And we've identified a few on the screen there that I think might resonate with many of you.
Okay.
So I was encouraged to actually speak to some of them. So, for example, one could be that we're all experiencing this. There's limited funding available for capacity building and intermediary support, but at the same time, there's a requirement for sophistication of data and technology and performance management. Funding is becoming increasingly short-term and project-based, and then if you look at, you're getting pushed down on this need for long-term proof of outcomes, which requires consistent base of core funding to do. And so it's a constant push-pull kind of scenario.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And we are receiving so much great feedback and amazing questions on our open chat. So thank you so much, and keep them coming and keep challenging us. This is the space to really help us shape how this work is going to move forward. I would love to just share a couple comments that I think are really adding value to the conversation, and we will try to address as many questions as we can through the webinar at the end. And if not, we will be following up and touching base with as many folks as we can. One comment that was really interesting is that primary care teams actually need to have a skills-based board in Ontario, and it's part of the contract with the ministry to receive funding. So that is an additional nuance to the conversation. So thank you very much for the person who shared that. As well, we had a comment that this webinar and the information that we're presenting to our webinar participants might be actually preaching to the choir about these challenges to assumptions. We did see a lot of people are not surprised by this information, but are happy to hear that it is being discussed on a provincial level. My question back to you is, how do we engage the folks we might be missing in the conversation who are not already on top of these trends that are developing? If you have ideas, strategies, things that you have tried that you know work, please let us know in the open chat. That would be so amazing. Thank you very much to the folks who are still engaged in this webinar. As well, you know, if you have noticed that there are trends and forces that we did not mention, of course, we did not present a comprehensive list of all of the research that has been done, but if there are any that you would really like us to know of, then please let us know in the open chat. And we will now talk about transformative thinking. I'll pass it back to Linda.
Thank you. Yeah, so let's sort of talk about what we can do about what we've heard around some of the assumptions and the environment in which we're working. Early in the initiative, the steering group asked itself this question: given what the research tells us, do we continue to do what we're doing to improve governance, or does it need more transformative thinking? By doing more of the same, we mean that we continue to develop more publications, provide more access to training programs, and create strategies for things like recruitment and running better board meetings. Or do we need to challenge the basic constructs of governance and apply transformative thinking to the ways that it could be done more effectively? We've now talked about two assumptions that based on your feedback is not surprising to you, but it's really interesting how those two assumptions, one, that board is the primary and the structure that is responsible for governance, and that secondly, that there isn't a lot of room to maneuver in terms of how governance is done. So we, in taking the time to sort of break down those assumptions and talk about them in a very different way, will open up very interesting opportunities for us. When we presented at the ONN conference in the fall and asked participants about assumptions or orthodoxies that they felt needed busting, they came up with a wall full of yellow stickies. And I think that tells us something about what we're taking for granted and not challenging in terms of the way we think about governance. The Mowat research paper written by Lisa, Peering into the Future, drew on extensive literature review, focus groups, and thought leader interviews, and it arrived at the conclusion that transformation is necessary. Based on that research, we at the initiative believe that just doing more publications and training won't be enough if board members have limited time or resources to invest in education, and there's nothing to lead us to believe that that will change. We see an environment and a sector that is in the process of profound change, and this environment and sector doesn't look much like it did when the basic governance structures were conceived. We also are not confident that the current way that boards are organized will necessarily attract next generation leaders. We actually did, in another piece of research, we talked to 100 emerging leaders or people working with emerging leaders, and we asked them about how they are responding and reacting to the way governance is done. And many of them said that we have a lot of alternative ways to do good. We're not necessarily going to be attracted to traditional organizations if it continues to be constructed the way governance is done in the same way. So that's a really interesting point that we need to keep in mind. And that just creating better board recruitment strategies won't allow organizations to acquire all the competencies they need to be able to address the issues coming up in this very competitive and complex environment. So that's why we concluded that we need to reimagine governance.
Thank you so much, Linda. And we know, and the steering committee has drafted this problem statement. We are here today testing our problem statement, trying to get feedback and trying to shape it into the future. So we're really keen to know what you think about the problem statement. So nonprofit organizations or nonprofit organizational governance is not well designed and is not adapting to the current or future environment. So we will be launching a poll shortly, right now, and please let us know what you think. And this is the beginning of the conversation. There are more discussions to be had in the future, so please be honest, let us know what you think in the open chat. And I'm going to let Linda speak a little bit more to the Reimagining Governance Initiative and what we're trying to do with it.
So the goal of reimagining governance, and when we talk about whether transformation is needed or not, the name of the initiative is sort of a giveaway. The goal of the initiative is to advance new approaches to the governance of nonprofit organizations, its structures, practices, and processes. And we understood early on that if we're going to find innovative solutions to deeply embedded structures and processes, we're going to need to use a social innovation approach. So that's the approach that we're taking. We've developed it as a series of phases. The first phase was to do the research, which we completed last fall. We're now in the second phase, which we're describing as the framing stage. And we're really taking the time, and this is an example of the kinds of ways that we're engaging with people, to really understand what is the problem that we need to solve, what are the challenges and potential for change, and what would success look like at the end of all of this. We're also working on building a network of advocates that can help us to bring about change. Erin's going to talk about that, or Sarah, at the end. So in this phase, we're going to be spending lots of time engaging with people out in the sector working on the front lines in this area. We're holding a strategic foresight session, and what we're doing in that is to say, let's leap forward and say, what does the not-for-profit sector look like 10 years from now? And if we look at that, what does governance need to look like if it's going to respond effectively to it? Remembering that governance isn't just about the board, that it goes beyond what the board. So once we have a real strong sense of the problem we're solving and what will help us bring about change and the potential for change, what some of the barriers are, we'll then launch, we hope in the fall, into getting down to solutions with lots of testing and refining. So we don't have an answer yet, and we've been very, very disciplined to really take our time and not leap to solutions, because it would be very easy to leap to some tactical things that could be done to improve things. But we're really going to take the time to go through this social innovation process. So that's, in a nutshell, the initiative. Lots more information on the ONN site that you can turn to.
And that we will send a link to as well. And perhaps, Linda, before I get you to speak to the 3 transformative questions that we're hoping participants will take away, we actually got a participant question about how exactly we're designing social innovation.
Oh,
I'm sorry, defining. Did I say designing?
You said designing.
So the way we're looking at this is, because governance is a very deeply embedded issue, we're coming at it from a design point of view that says we've got to really dig deep to figure out, as I mentioned, what problem we're solving. So we're using social innovation as opposed to just saying, okay, here's the research, let's immediately go to what the solutions are. Also, I think a really important principle that will drive this is a co-design principle. So we're not going to come up with solutions sort of in isolation of what's really going on, and we're going to be bringing lots of people into helping us to co-design what that solution looks like.
Thank you so much, Linda. So I will just have you explain and present the transformative questions that we are hoping our participants will take away.
So we think that there are 3 critical questions that organizations should be asking their boards if they want to really almost shake things up and do things differently. So these aren't questions that you'll see typically in training programs about governance and boards and how to make them more effective. But we think maybe these questions, if asked within your board and staff and some other stakeholders who are involved in governance in your organizations, that it may uncover some interesting insights for you. The first is, given the disruptive trends and forces impacting nonprofit organizations, do we have the right governance design and competencies to meet them with confidence? What should be changed or adapted to do that? And I think there are some great sources of information, the 3 research papers that we have sent out to you, the research paper on trends and forces impacting the nonprofit sector sort of looks at what some of those trends and forces are that you'll need to be able to respond to. So that would be the first question. The second is, if we only had 3 board members, and legally you actually only need 3 board members, but if we had 3 board members, what competencies would they need to have? Given that these 3 people can't do it all, how would you fulfill governance requirements? What insights emerge from the conversation about how it can be done more effectively? In this question, we're not proposing that you actually go to a 3-person board, but by asking yourselves, if we had only 3 people, it may cause you to really think about your competency matrix. So many organizations have competency matrix that say we need a lawyer, we need a constituent, we need a younger person. And if you, with the discipline of saying we can only have 3 board members, it'd be really interesting, I think, what kinds of things would begin to surface that is core and necessary, and then ways you could actually do research beyond the board. So that's question number 2. Question number 3 is, what processes or culture can we put in place to broaden our governance decision-making beyond the board? So bringing in some more participatory decision-making models, what might that look like? What's that mean to culture if we're actually going to open up our governance decision-making beyond the board? So that would be a third question that might, all of which might get your board and staff and other stakeholders to begin to maybe think a little bit differently about how governance could be done.
Thank you so much, Linda. And just to re-emphasize, these are questions for you to take into your organizations, into your communities, into the work that you're doing. And we really do truly hope to hear back from you on these questions, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps a week from now, perhaps a few weeks from now, after you've had a chance to really have conversations with those around you. Now, I know Sarah sent a message to everybody, but we will be getting to answering some more questions in just a minute, because we are doing really amazing on time. But first, I'm going to let you know how you can help be a part of this work further. So we are hoping to convene a group of champions to really help us with our Reimagining Governance initiative. We are looking for folks to be involved in an array of methods and engagement ways, but if you would like to be a little bit more involved, a little bit more hands-on, please do send me an email. My email is right here on the slide, which we will be sending out, as well as all the other resources that we have shared with you today after the webinar has finished. So yes, you can please email us your conversations and insights that you have after having these conversations based on the questions that we have asked. And if you have even more questions, I would love to hear those as well. And okay, so I will continue to encourage everybody to send us questions via the open chat. We are receiving a ton, so I'm going to just throw them at Lisa and Linda and see how they manage.
Okay. Catch the ball.
So we are proposing that governance does not equal the board. So one of the questions we have received is, what is the difference then between the board and management, especially because we have mentioned that some board members are taking on operational duties?
You can take that one.
Well, first of all, what's interesting is, and I think, Lisa, you said this, that operational work is not governance work.
Right.
And I think that's really important to understand. So if boards are involved in operational work, they're doing it outside the responsibility of governance. And so I think that's a really important way to separate. So when you're doing operational work, and if there are staff involved, then that needs to be named and distinguished from the work of governance. And so I think that's a really important part. You're doing it in part. Operational work is being done with staff, and so it's a very different kind of work.
Right. And it may be useful to actually go back, if you're able to the slide that I spoke to. It had the functions. Go back one more. Sorry, guys. Yeah, and that's a great visual representation of the core legal requirements and how governance has evolved over time. And so what we attempted to do, and we didn't have enough time to do it justice in these 5-minute intervals that we've had, but the paper is an easy, accessible read, and it goes into this in a little bit more detail around, how these functions over time, like what are these functions, what boards have taken on, and then is it working for boards right now? And the research showed that it isn't. What the paper does as well is it provides a few examples of organizations doing different, approaching governance in different ways. And one that surfaced that I thought was really interesting, and I know it wouldn't work for all organizations, but there's critical learning there, I think, for this exercise, and that is Ecology Ottawa. So all the Ottawa folks out there, there's a great example in Ottawa. They're a nonprofit, volunteer-driven organization, and they have the minimum legal requirement for board representation. So they have 3, and what they do is that they engage team leaders and volunteers on issues as they arise, which is so fascinating. So they're really about distributed leadership and distributed management, and with the 3 board members adhering to the legal requirements. So that's a really great example. And so I encourage everyone to read the paper and go into, dive into some of these examples and some of the more detail behind the summary statements we're making here today.
Thank you so much, Lisa and Linda. And that's a great segue into our next question, which is to please try to explain the seeming contradiction between the idea that governance does not just equal the board to the board ultimately being responsible and liable for the organization.
You want to take that?
Well, I almost feel like I might be repeating what I said, but so if you look at that slide, so we'll stay on that slide, there are core requirements that the boards are required to adhere to and deliver on, and those are from elected board directors, and so that can't go away. That has to be in place. I think what's at question here really is all those other functions in that visual that you're looking at, be it fundraising or advocacy, even meaningful engagement, because we talk about diversity, but if we reframe it around meaningful engagement, how can we enable more meaningful engagement of the constituency that we serve, the constituents or people we serve? Is it best done through a board of 8 to 12 people, or with the advances of technology, can we engage more meaningfully on strategy with a broader group of people than we could ever before? So we're really challenging the norms and challenging functions that that boards are taking on that they may not need to or have to.
And I would add another good example to that, and that is strategic planning. There's nothing in the legal requirements of boards that says that boards should be doing strategic planning. It does say that boards have a responsibility to ensure, for example, the strategic plan isn't going to cause them to go bankrupt, that it stays on mission, that it fulfills a certain number of expectations. But there is nothing from a legal point of view or regulatory point of view that says boards have to do strategic planning. And so that's part of the opening up to sort of say, okay, if it doesn't have to be done by the board, then what is the absolute best way to do strategic planning? Who should be participating? What kind of guardrails would the board put in place to make sure it's fulfilling its legal and regulatory requirements? But then who are the best people to go ahead and create that strategic plan? So it's another example.
And I'm going to add one more, and this is a bit contentious, so I'll throw it out there, but fundraising. And having worked in the nonprofit sector for a long time, and having advocated for my boards to fundraise, there is a huge need and call for boards to actively fundraise and to donate. And what we've seen from the research is that boards are increasingly becoming about revenue generation. And the question is that what we found through the research is that most boards are struggling with it. So therefore, is it the right thing to continue emphasizing or focusing on, or do we have to consider different approaches? We didn't in our paper come up with a solution. We just identified the trend and identified the question for exploration through this work.
And as we move to the next stage of our social innovation process, where we actually start to tackle solutions, those are the kinds of issues that we'll be tackling.
So people can stay tuned then. Conscious that we are in a big city, we had a question around the idea of governance effectiveness being influenced by the size of the city and what this means for rural boards. Could we please speak to that?
Well, I think it perhaps touches on what we found in one of the trends, which is the workforce is changing. And we do have a lot of older people on the boards that are actually stepping down. And I'm from a small town, and if anyone's from Kirkland Lake or Timmins, that's where I hail from. So I understand the unique challenges that that small communities face in securing funding, in attracting volunteers. I think the big issue is funding is going to be an increasingly significant issue, and boards are going to have to be focused on revenue. And there's going to continue to be recruitment issues, I would think, in those communities. Go ahead.
Yeah, and it's interesting, again, back to this point, it's how you ask the question. So when you look at the diagram Lisa's been talking about, and all the add-ons that have been given to board roles, even though it's not part of the legal regulatory, I think we need to start, and particularly in rural communities where your access to people is more limited than in a large city, start asking, do they need to sit on the board and fulfill responsibilities like, accountability and fiduciary responsibilities? Are there ways to draw in other leadership volunteers to do some of the other work and make it very task specific? So that, again, it's thinking about, instead of saying all this work must be done by the board of directors, start asking, what are the creative ways, utilizing technology, for example, that this could be done in a very different way.
Right, and I'm going to throw something out there too. I mean, rural communities are more, they are already experiencing these trends of, increasingly difficult access for funding, increasingly difficult to secure volunteers, increasing focus on consolidation and mergers, and I think it's going to keep coming. Especially in this current environment. Yeah. And so the question then is there a separate approach needed for rural nonprofits that might be distinct from the cities? Because often, at least in my experience, that the cities and the small communities get lumped into this is the solution, and it often doesn't work for both.
That's right.
And so maybe that's an element of the feedback that a consideration for this exercise.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to thank everyone who is sending in these questions that are challenging us and helping us think about this work in different ways. If you are in a rural community and this does touch your work and speak to your work, we are even more interested to hear your thoughts on the transformative questions that we are asking. Please give us all of your insights and questions, and we'd love to ensure that we are having a nuanced approach to the work that we are undertaking.
I have another thought. It came to someone contacted me more recently from my hometown, and they were talking, it was actually Haileybury, but not that matters, and they were talking about their fundraising challenges. And what was interesting was that this particular group had a very they were approaching fundraising from, we went to the richest people in the community and we got the funding, and now we're at a standstill and we have this gap. And, you know, as we talked through it, there was this beautiful group of young people that wanted to be engaged, that they weren't engaging. And so through that discussion, what we determined was that, you know, they needed to really throw away traditional concepts of fundraising and try to engage young people in a way they had never done before. Right. I mean, we're getting into a bit of an example, but that was, you know, one example of the board kind of realizing that their traditional approach wasn't actually being effective in engaging young people in the community.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to thank you, Lisa, because we are getting lots of folks asking for more examples like Ecology Ottawa that we can speak to. So that's another great one.
Right.
I'm going to actually combine a couple questions that really stem from the conversation we've already been having now. And that is, how do we really open up governance? How do we really start to distinguish between these core governance functions and the other things that boards are currently doing? And related to that, what are some of the strategies that we can come up with to provide community representation outside of the board level? I think folks are really having a tough time thinking about these methods.
You know, it's not surprising that it's hard to think about these methods, a different way of, a different mindset to this, because it is fairly profound, the change in mindset that's required. I was talking to a younger person than me, which is a big group of people, but and I was saying to them, look, why is it that we presume that somebody has to be on the board in order to be deeply engaged in governance kind of work, or in operational work like fundraising and other aspects? And our research with emerging leaders actually indicated that they cared less about that. And so we got talking about, well, is there another name that we could give to people that we engage deeply in our organization around governance kinds of things, without them having to come to 12 board meetings or 6 board meetings a year, but they could put it on their resume and it looked good, like saying I'm a board member at such and such. And this person came up with impact advisor. And I thought that was really interesting. And so maybe part of our work is to start to create more cachet for other titles where people can get engaged in this kind of work without having to fit into this construct of 12 people sitting around the table 6 times a year. So I think that's kind of creative thinking. So a lot of people have said they like the title of an impact advisor.
And I wanted to point out that you know, I actually think a lot of the challenges in governance are deeply rooted in the board's or the sector's understanding of impact. Mm-hmm. And we get into that a little bit in the paper. On page 26, there's an actual visual that is examples of potential governance pathways. And I'll just speak to one, because I think framing it this way could help encourage debate and discussion that could generate some really interesting insights. But, you know, as a board thinks about its duty of care, for example, some board members can actually interpret that or internalize that to mean it's about they're going to create policies that make sure that their own data on their own constituents is protected and private and only used for their own organization's use. Whereas a different kind of board might actually say, you know, we want policies and capacity supports that align data needs and priorities across a whole bunch of organizations that are trying to perhaps, say, deal with, you know, preventing child abuse. And so they might have to work with different systems, whether it's, you know, health, or whether it's criminal justice, whether it's education and children's social services. And so therefore, they create policies that open up their data sets in a way that can be shared, the data can be shared ethically. Whereas the other organization that I mentioned, their data policies might be closed that prohibits that sharing, which means that organizations and service delivery organizations have less information that they need to make sound decisions on a whole about how that child, for example, is interacting within the system, right? So that's just one example. And if you look at the paper, it'll give you a bit more detail than we can explain here.
And I think this notion of collaboration and integration and utilizing that more effectively, in my experience, what's interesting is with boards, because of a mindset, can be very sort of mission down focused. So they feel what we have to do is protect our organization. If boards started to have more of a collaboration system approach to the way they came at some of their work and started to look at the potential for collaboration outside with other organizations, that's how a lot of more work could be done. And in fact, I believe that 5-6 years from now, we're going to see, if organizations aren't working more in the area of collaboration and integration, even around the work of governance, then they're going to get left behind.
Thank you so much, Linda and Lisa, for that fascinating conversation. I think we have time for one more question. Maybe we can squeeze in another one. But I think this is an important one to discuss. And of course, this phase of our project is really just about sparking these conversations, getting used to and comfortable with these kinds of questions that we are asking in the sector right now. So perhaps we don't have necessarily firm strategies in mind yet, but these are still great questions to think of. What are some of the approaches that we can take to address the tensions that can arise in the board or within an organization if we are delegating decision-making outside of the board level?
It's a tough one. Yeah.
You know,
Good question, whoever wrote
I think what's fascinating is, and I know what would be great is if we could provide sort of a simple answer to that question, but there isn't one, because it's a mindset shift. And that mindset shift in terms of the role of the board and the role of other voices in the way we do governance. So if we can start doing that, breaking down that board isn't the only one responsible for governance decision making, and start there, look at your culture, look at your processes, look at your mindset, and start to think, come at it from that point of view. I think that's the starting place. But there isn't a simple answer to that question, because it is a real shift in mindset that's required.
And I think the sector, individual organizations are going to be, they need support from the sector, like the discussions ONN is generating here, to encourage a shift in this mindset. Because I don't think individual organizations can do this alone. Because you're changing mindset, and therefore you're changing behavior. And research shows that takes time, and it takes talking and doing over an extended period of time. So I think this is a good starting point.
And just a final point before Erin cuts us off, is I think what's interesting is when the research was done, one of the goals was to find really transformative examples of how governance is done very differently, and there were none, or very few.
There were a few, but we struggled. We really struggled.
Really struggled. So what's interesting in all of this, and maybe as we go forward, is kind of acknowledging that this idea of really coming at governance and really reimagining it, we can build on some of the things that are going to be done, but that's what makes it even more important to really come at it a very different way.
And we have 4 or 5 examples in the Peering into the Future paper for those wanting more examples, because one of the most interesting ones I've talked about now is the Winnipeg Boldness Project in terms of defining meaningful beneficiary engagement and decision making. Really fascinating example. So check that out if you can.
Okay, thank you so much. And so we are at the end of our webinar. Thank you to everybody who were so engaged, participating, listening, learning, sharing, challenging. We'd like to also thank the funders of this project, Ignite NPS, City of Toronto, and the Toronto Foundation. I would also love to extend a huge thank you to Linda and Lisa for being leaders in this work of reimagining governance. And of course, again, thank you. Just a reminder that we will be sharing all the resources and a copy of the webinar as well via email sometime today. And as well, if you'd like to follow along the conversation. We would love to ensure that we're providing regular updates, answering questions to the broader public, and really pushing and driving these conversations forward. So please stay engaged. You can subscribe to our newsletter where we will be sharing these insights. And I have shared my email, which will be sent along in the slides. And so you can get in touch with me and we can continue the conversation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thanks for hosting us.
Yes, thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everybody.